Ladies and gents, we are less than 1 week away from the first epic raid ever inside of Destiny 2. Now, to be honest, we don't really know what that's going to look like. We essentially just did an epic raid inside of Destiny Rising this weekend, which added a few more mechanics, but honestly, it wasn't much different than the original version of the Destiny Rising raid. Now, it is possible that we hop into the Desert Perpetual on Saturday, and it's a very similar story. However, considering the more advanced not swap modifier, the streaming requirements, and the nerfs that have hit a lot of our meta damage options in the past couple weeks, we're not taking any chances. If you're wondering why Cross isn't on the mic, my name is Luke. If you've had a chance to tune into stream or the TWAB, you'll know Cross has been extremely sick this weekend. Pulling a 108 fever in the ER is no joke, man. Now don't worry, he's okay, but for the time being, I'm filling in until he recovers. Now with all that being said, as per usual, we've gone ahead and audited all of the changes Bungie has made since Ash and Iron to make sure that our abilities, weapons, and armor are functioning as intended. So you can start looking at what you're building into going into the raid this weekend. Now, these past few weeks have been a little confusing in terms of updates. Bungie has been implementing live update patches, they're reverting some changes they just made to some of our exotic weapons, and they've even announced some updates that aren't hitting the game until mid-October. Honestly, it's kind of a mess. So we're going to do our best to set things straight today, starting off with abilities. Warlocks have received the majority of the changes here. When standing inside an empowering rift, you are now granted grenade, melee, and class ability energy over time. Final blows while standing inside an empowering rift now generates bonus, special, and heavy ammo progress. Now you can see this in action in game. When standing in our rift, we get very small increases to the regen rates of all our abilities. Then when getting kills, our ammo meters progress just a little bit faster. This seems to grant about 15% for special ammo and 10% for heavy ammo. Also, something to note is that the energy gained while standing inside your rift is directly tied to your stats. So the higher a given stat, the faster you'll get it back when in an empowering rift. The Weaver's Call aspect also received a change. This now generates roosted Threadling progress when dealing damage of any type. It's not tied to strand anymore. Also, Threadling damage now returns class ability energy, and this works on all Threadling damage so long as you have Weaver's Call equipped. You'll notice a trend as we go through more of these changes that Bungie seems to really want us to use more Threadling based builds, especially with some of the changes we'll discuss shortly. The Weavewalk aspect has also gotten some buffs. First, you're now granted Woven Mail for you and nearby allies upon exiting Weavewalk, and the uptime for Woven Mail is determined by the amount of time you spend in Weavewalk. For example, if I spend 1 melee charge and exit, this will grant me 10 seconds. But if I spend 2 melee charges, this grants a whopping 20 seconds to myself and any allies nearby. So a very strong change overall. Weavewalk also had its horizontal movement speed on enter and exit increased, which is certainly noticeable looking at them both side by side. And if that wasn't good enough, Weavewalk has had another fragment slot added, going from 2 to 3, allowing for even more build flexibility. So overall, some very good changes to Weavewalk, which would make it a solid aspect for survivability. Because remember, you get 90% DR while in Weavewalk, and then when you exit, that's a further 45% from Woven Mail. Now, something to keep in mind, the max amount of Woven Mail you can receive is 20 seconds, even if you consume 3 melees. Moving on from Strand, we have a change to the stasis aspect Frostpulse, which reads, freezing enemies now generates class ability energy. This also works for all stasis freezes, not just freezing via Frostpulse. So you can run this alongside Ice Flare Bolts or Bleak Watchers and get your class ability back very fast. And in some cases, instantly, if you freeze enough enemies with your initial Rift cast. Finally, for our Warlock abilities, we have Pocket Singularity, a very underused melee, at least in PvE. This now has 2 melee charges at base, projectile lifetime has been increased from 1.1 to 2 seconds, and the projectile tracking should now favor targets closer to the initial trajectory so it feels more consistent. This also got a slight reduction to knockback on players in PvP by 50%. Will this make Pocket Singularity the new meta? Probably not, but the changes are welcome, and I can say from testing that the tracking certainly feels more consistent. Now, before moving on, I do want to mention that there's one big change that I'm personally very much looking forward to that didn't go through this update, but that is the change to Warlock turrets counting as grenades for stats and perks. This was a change that was discussed a couple of weeks back, and we figured it would come around this update, but that is not the case, so hopefully we'll receive this sooner rather than later. Moving on to our hunters, the big change here is a slight tune made to Gambler's Dodge. Previously, your melee stat only needed to be at 70 or above to get back a full melee charge. This has now been changed to be at 100 melee or above, so it requires a little bit more investment. However, Bungie has also brought back the old functionality of dodging near enemies, but with a slight twist. Dodging near enemies will grant double your melee energy, but it's dependent on your melee stat. So instead of needing 100 to get back a full charge, if you're next to an enemy and dodge at 50 melee stat, this should also give you a full charge. Now this also means that when at 100 melee, dodging your enemies can grant you 2 full melee charges. Now Gambler's Dodge was also nerfed in PvP, where the amount of energy generated was reduced by 20%. But this was actually just patched to be the full 50% as intended. Now as you can see here, when at 100 melee and dodging with no enemies present, this grants just about 50% of our energy back. But if we dodge near enemies, this will give us that full charge. Honestly, this was a nerf that was bound to happen. Bungie had changed the functionality of Gambler's Dodge and Edge of Fate to not require enemies in close proximity, and this was the only thing holding Gambler's Dodge back from being overpowered in PvP, which we've had to deal with for the past couple months, so it's not being completely reverted, but this hybrid setup with reduced energy gains in PvP should solve a majority of the issues. On the topic of PvP, lightweight knives have also been nerfed quite a bit, having their damage reduced in PvP by 16%. Pre-patch, these were dealing 152 to the head and 117 to the body, but post, these are hitting for 131 to the head and 101 to the body. Now moving on to some general changes, because actually we didn't get any Titan ability changes this update, and those alongside more Hunter ability changes are actually coming in a later update in October. Don't worry guys, 4 extra stasis crystals, it'll be worth the wait! Starting with Woven Mail, this no longer resets its duration when a new source of Woven Mail is applied. So for example, if we have 20 seconds of Woven Mail from Weavewalk, when we pick up an Orb of Power with Threat of Warding, this actually won't refresh our timer at all due to this change. Threadlings have received another buff, getting 20% increase in damage against combatants. This combined with the Exotic Pulse and Artifact mods we received in Ash and Iron, yeah guys, Threadling builds right now are kind of popping off. Wrapping up our abilities, super damage no longer scales with your grenade or melee stats. If you didn't know, certain supers like Song of Flame or Arc Staff would get increased damage not only from the super stat, but the melee and grenade stat as well. This, however, is not the case anymore, as your super damage is now strictly tied to your super stat with nothing else affecting it. Moving on to our exotic armor. Titans got a massive rework to Strongholds that you can see here on screen. However, Bungie did inform us in the Renegades live stream that these changes would be reverted in a future update. For that reason, we're not going to deep dive into the changes here, but yes, we did test them and Strongholds do function differently than they did pre-patch. There was also a change made to Peacekeepers, but specifically for Teraba and Ravenous Beast. Bungie reduced the Peacekeepers' bonus damage when using Teraba with Ravenous Beast active from 100 to 70%. This combo was allowing for crazy fast super regeneration, so yeah, Bungie brought it in line, and as a side note, they increased the zoom from 15 to 16. Moving on to our hunters. Lucky Pants have been given the ability to buff both Sturm overcharge shots and paracausal shots from Hawkmoon. However, both of these are buffed at a much lower efficacy than other hand cannons. Hawkmoon only gains a 50% buff to paracausal shot at 10x a legally modded holster, and Sturm overcharge shots get a 110% buff. So not the 450 increase that we usually see from Lucky Pants with hand cannons, but these weren't getting buffed previously, so it's definitely nice to have it now. Next up, Cyrtarachne's Facade received a change where kills while Woven Mail is active will return some health. While on paper, this sounds good, it's a very small amount of health per kill. While a nice change in theory, it's not going to be something many people will even notice. Something to note is this only applies to the base exotic, and the exotic class item version does not receive this change. However, Spirit of Cyrtarachne did receive a nerf, having its Woven Mail duration decrease from 10 to 6 seconds. This was unintentional and has already been reverted back to 10 seconds. Last up, we have our Warlocks, who again have the most changes here out of any of the classes. First up, Boots of the Assembler. These have finally been fixed to allow Noble Seekers to target allies standing inside your rifts or wells. Previously, the Seekers would only target allies if they were outside of a rift or well of radiance, making these useless for damage phases. Now that these work as intended, I can totally see them becoming a major player for damage phases. Remember guys, Boots of the Assembler grants a 35% damage buff when the Noble Seekers hit your allies, which is kinda nuts. The new exotic Eunoia also received a buff. It had the projectile damage at max range increased from 15 to 20%. Also, the distance to damage curve was tuned to make the maximum damage distance easier to identify. Increased projectile tracking by 40%, and now the submunitions also benefit from Ember of Ashes and Ember of Eruption. And the most notable change from this has definitely been the projectile tracking. Before, the projectiles sort of just did whatever they wanted, and sometimes wouldn't even attempt to track an enemy. Now though, they're pretty aggressive, and more often than not, they'll find something to hit. Next, we have a change to Contraverse Hold, which on paper sounds like a buff, but it leaves a lot to be desired. First off, charged grenades will now apply weaken, but each individual grenade has had its energy return tuned. For vortex grenades, this can no longer proc the exotic perk twice, but to compensate, the amount of energy gained has been increased. But in practice, this usually leads to less overall energy being gained when compared to pre-patch. Same is true for Axiom Bolts, Handheld Supernova, and Scatter Grenades. They all receive moderate increases to energy gains, but in-game, it's either less or at best about the same. Now, we did learn in the TWAB that for Vortex Grenades specifically, these are going to be reverted to where they can trigger the perk twice, granting more energy. Last up, for our exotic armor, we have a change that was made to Chromatic Fire. Now, similar to Strongholds, this is being reverted in a future patch. However, this actually goes live on Tuesday, alongside the fix for Contraverse Hold and a fix for young Ahamkar's spine. So long story short, Chromatic Fire is going to feel exactly the same as it did previously, and thank God, because right now it feels terrible. Wrapping up, we've got our weapon changes. And honestly, there isn't a lot to cover here, especially because most of these changes are actually going to be reverted anyway. One of the more exciting changes is that certain enhanced perks are actually getting buffed. Rather than granting an arbitrary +5 to random stats, Bungie has changed the enhanced benefits, so it's actually a slight upgrade to the perks themselves. This hasn't been done for every enhanced perk in the game, but some of the notable changes are Chill Clip, which activates even lower in the magazine. Hatchling now has the chance to spawn 2 Threadlings instead of 1. Headstone will now always generate a large stasis crystal on precision kills. Chain Reaction and Dragonfly both had their explosion damage increased by 10% when enhanced. So yeah, some pretty nice changes, and I hope Bungie follows this trend in the future because this actually feels like what enhanced perks should be. Burning Ambition alone has received a whole essay of buffs, but TLDR, this should be activating sooner and require less shots overall than it previously did. Now next up, we have a nerf that hits pretty close to home. Temporal Blast. Bungie reduced the blast damage impulse by 66%. And perhaps more importantly, you no longer gain progress on splash damage. This results in around a whopping 75% nerf to both crossbows and rocket launchers. And it's not just the damage. The amount of time required to proc these explosions has increased as well. So looking ahead at the raid, it may be best you run temporal armaments simply for that 17% increase in damage against Vex combatants. We'll be doing some damage testing this week just to be sure, but yeah guys, Temporal Blast got nerfed hard, which is kind of upsetting because we planned on running this mod essentially until Renegades launched in December. Looking at our exotic weapons, Sturm received a massive rework, but it's also bugged and is buffing ability damage, which at the time of making this video still hasn't been patched. So enjoy it while you can. My guess is that in Tuesday's update, this will get patched, and if not then, it'll be disabled during the day 1 raid this weekend. But looking at the actual intended changes, when getting kills with Together Forever primary weapons, like Drang, this loads an increased amount of overcharge shots to Sturm. From testing, this seems to be anywhere between 3 to 5 shots per kill. Because of this change, Bungie has also reduced the max number of overcharge shots you can hold down from 99 to 25. The overcharge shots have also had their damage tuned against each combatant tier. They are as follows: 260% against bosses, 280% against mini-bosses and champions, 300% against minors and majors, and 75% against players. Kills with Sturm overcharged shots will now overflow the mag of Together Forever weapons until death, capping out at 100% of the base mag size. Sturm was also given an updated catalyst, where kills with Sturm overcharged shots grant charges that provide a 50% ready and stow speed scaler for Sturm and Together Forever weapons. 1 stack is consumed upon readying Sturm or a Together Forever weapon, and you can hold a max of 6 stacks. So overall, very solid changes to one of our oldest exotic weapons in the entire game. And speaking of old weapons, MIDA Multi-Tool also received a host of changes. Faster handling and ADS, increased range and stability, aim assist, explosive rounds, and reload speed from its catalyst. All of these changes went through, and we'll be doing a full review of MIDA sometime in the next week or so. Graviton Spike has also received a nerf, although it only aims to affect its insane performance inside of PvP. The time to gain overcharge shots has been reduced from 20 seconds to 7 seconds, and the time to gain the buff from the temporal alignment catalyst has been reduced from infinite down to 7 seconds. Again, this does technically affect the gun in both PvE and PvP, however, it doesn't affect the performance of the weapon in PvP much at all. Bungie also teased another nerf arriving this Tuesday in update 9.1.0.2, lowering the PvP AoE damage on stasis overcharge hits against players from 30 down to 1. So essentially non-existent. Now, a major change that's going to affect the day one raid is the nerfs to super regen, specifically on weapons like Outbreak, Barrow-Dyad, and Hierarchy of Needs. The super energy gained has been reduced, but it is certainly very noticeable. As post-patch, we didn't get our super back with any of these nearly as fast. However, roaming supers appear to be unaffected, as they're still getting massive energy gains, similar to how they were pre-patch. Maybe it's a bug, or maybe Bungie was just trying to target instant damage supers, which are usually more viable for DPS. Speaking of bugs, New Land Beyond had its max stacks of the Master increase from 100 to 999. This change was just supposed to be a joke and purely visual. However, the catalyst now does not work properly. Normally, at 20 stacks, the catalyst would proc, allowing you to shoot without reloading. This is no longer the case. Instead, it procs at 200 stacks. Ay, ay, ay. Next up, we have Lord of Wolves, which had its hipfire damage reduced versus bosses by 20%. And I don't think this one's getting reverted, guys. Queenbreaker and Grand Overture should be changed this Tuesday, but the Lord of Wolves nerf is here to stay. RIP! Bungie fixed an issue with Thunderlord where the catalyst was refilling more ammo than intended. So what this means is rather than being able to empty your entire reserves of Thunderlord, you now have to reload at around the halfway point. So the new damage formula is pull the trigger, reload, and then win. Whirling Ovation received a buff where the rate the anticipation meter builds was increased. Now this isn't a massive change by any means, but it takes about one less shot with Mint Retrograde to fill the meter now post-patch. Wrapping up with some miscellaneous weapon changes, the Forgivness sidearm had its range stat reduced by 15 across the board. And aggressive SMGs, like Immortal, have had their ADS damage falloff scaler increased from 1.4 to 1.5 for more range overall. Spreadshot hand cannons got a slight 8% damage increase only against combatants and PvE. They've also had their pellet spread angle increased by 5%, and Bungie's added a 0.1 second delay between melee and firing. From what I've heard, 0.1 second isn't enough, but hunters, you tell me how it feels. The flinch dealt to players by Spreadshot hand cannons has also been decreased by 30%. Sniper rifles now get 2 ammo bricks in the Crucible instead of 1, and crossbow bolts now have a heavy ammo marker visible to the player who owns them, and they receive the correct silhouette for kill feeds in the weapon tray. And that's it. That's all the major changes Bungie has made in the past 2 weeks to the sandbox. Again, this Tuesday, the 23rd, Bungie is pushing out another patch that'll do a variety of things alongside nerfing our OP no ammo lightweight swords. Rip the dream, baby. It's been fun while it lasted. We'll be covering that patch live and also prepping for that day one epic raid launch this Saturday. Fellas and ladies, thank you all for coming and watching, and as always,
slap that like button like your mama told you right.